Australia's residential land is worth $8.3 trillion. That's 3 times the country's entire GDP. It's more valuable than every share on the Australian stock market, more valuable than every superannuation fund, more valuable than every business, every mine, every farm combined. $8.3 trillion sitting under houses. And on any given night, 122,000 Australians have nowhere to sleep. Not in a metaphorical sense, in the most literal sense imaginable. They are in tents, they are in cars, they are on park benches, they are on the couches of people who can barely afford their own rent. This is a country where the dirt is worth more than most national economies, and 122,000 people can't find a door to close behind them. This is the story of how the richest land on earth created the largest underclass of invisible homeless in the developed world. And why nobody, not the government, not the banks, not the voters, wants to fix it. To understand how insane $8.3 trillion is, let's put it in perspective. Australia's total GDP, everything the country produces in an entire year, is roughly $2.8 trillion. The land under Australian houses is worth 3 times that. In 1989, residential land was valued at 1.1 times GDP, just slightly more than the total economy. By 2025, it had tripled to 3 times GDP. The land didn't get bigger, the country didn't discover new continents, the dirt just got more expensive. And here's the part that should disturb you. Land now makes up 75% of the value of Australia's total housing stock. In 1990, it was 54%. The bricks, the timber, the plumbing, the roof, they're almost irrelevant. When you buy a house in Australia, you're not buying a building, you're buying a postcode. Since the year 2000, the median lot price has increased by 514%. In that same period, construction costs went up by about 150%. The gap between those two numbers is where the crisis lives. And over the last 25 years, residential land has been the fastest growing asset class in Australia, growing by 832%, outperforming shares, outperforming superannuation, outperforming everything. Nearly half, 49%, of all household wealth gains in 2025 came from one single source, the land under people's houses going up in value. Not from wages, not from innovation, not from building businesses, just from owning dirt in the right suburb at the right time. As one economic journalist put it, the great Australian dream might be to own a home, but really it is the land on which your home is built that is of real value. That's the dream now, not hard work, not merit, dirt. Now let me show you the other side. On census night in 2021, the most recent count, 122,494 people were homeless in Australia. That number has grown from 95,000 in 2001, from 102,000 in 2011, from 116,000 in 2016. The line only goes one direction, up. And that number, 122,000, is a dramatic undercount because Australia defines homelessness differently than most countries. Only 7,600 of those people were sleeping rough, on streets, in parks, under bridges. That's 6% of the homeless total. The rest were invisible. 47,900 were in severely overcrowded dwellings, rooms packed with bodies because nobody could afford their own space. 24,200 were in boarding houses. 19,300 were couch surfing, staying temporarily with friends or family who themselves could barely make rent. Over 17,600 were children under 12. Let me say that again. 17,600 children under the age of 12 were homeless in Australia, in a country sitting on $8.3 trillion of residential land. And it's getting worse. Rough sleeping surged by 22% nationally in the 3 years to 2024. In New South Wales alone, it jumped by 51%. Not among drug addicts, not among criminals, among ordinary people who got priced out. Housing affordability stress, the number one reason people contact homelessness services, increased by 36% in 3 years. And the people seeking help aren't who you think. The proportion of employed people accessing homelessness services rose from 10.9% to 15.3% in just 5 years. These aren't people who lost their way, these are people who lost their rent. If you're homeless in Australia and you ask the government for help, here's what happens. You go on a list, a very, very long list. As of the 2026 Productivity Commission report, 254,571 households are waiting for social housing in Australia. That includes 122,457 classified as greatest need on priority wait lists. That priority list alone grew by 12% in a single year. And while you wait, the crisis deepens around you. 1 in 3 people, more than 56,000 individuals who needed crisis or longer-term accommodation last year were turned away. Not rejected, not deemed ineligible, turned away because there was literally no space. Every single hour, more than 3,200 people contact homelessness services across Australia. That's not a typo. Every hour. Around the clock, 3,200 people asking for help, and the system that's supposed to catch them is collapsing under the weight. 77% of homelessness agencies said it was significantly harder to find housing for their clients in 2024 compared to the previous year. The median duration of support, how long agencies have to work with each person before finding them somewhere to live, has increased by 44% in 5 years. Support workers describe a completely clogged system where people exit homelessness services and walk straight back into the same homelessness they were trying to escape because there's nowhere to go. 640,000 households are currently unable to access affordable housing. Without decisive action, that number will grow. And yet, the land beneath Australian homes keeps rising in value every single quarter, like clockwork. This crisis was not an accident, it was a policy choice. Decades of policy choices. After the Second World War, Australia had a housing crisis too, and the government did something radical. It built homes, directly, at scale. Between 1945 and 1970, government construction accounted for 16% of all residential building in Australia. The government was the builder, and it worked. In 1947, only 53% of Australians owned a home. By 1966, that number had risen to 71%, the highest home ownership rate in Australian history, built on the back of public housing that was accessible to working families, not just the destitute. Then, slowly, deliberately, the government stopped. From the mid-1990s onward, government builds accounted for just 3% of total construction. Public housing, as a share of all housing, fell from 6% in 1996 to 2.9% by 2020. The stock wasn't replaced. It wasn't expanded. It was allowed to decay. At its peak, Australia had over 300,000 public housing dwellings. Today, the proportion of Australians in social housing is among the lowest in the developed world, lower than Denmark, lower than France, vastly lower than the UK at its peak. Australia's public housing stock as a percentage of total housing is around 4%. In the Netherlands, it's 30%. In Austria, 24%. And while public housing shrank, something else grew. The tax system was rewired to turn property into an investment machine. In 2000, the capital gains tax discount was introduced, halving the tax on property profits. Negative gearing let investors deduct rental losses from their income tax. Together, these two policies did more to inflate Australian property prices than any amount of immigration, any amount of demand, any amount of foreign buyers. The Australian government now spends more on tax breaks for property investors than it does on social housing, homelessness services, and rent assistance combined. Let that sink in. Tax breaks for landlords cost $12.3 billion in 2025. The entire National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness received $1.9 billion. The people who own the land get $12 billion. The people who have nowhere to live get less than $2. Australia likes to think of itself as an egalitarian country, the land of the fair go, where hard work gets you ahead. That story is dead. In 2019-20, the wealthiest 20% of Australian households had 5 times the income of the bottom 20%. CEO salaries have been rising at 10 to 15% per year. Worker wages have been rising at 3 to 4%. But income inequality is only half the picture. Wealth inequality, driven almost entirely by property, is where the real damage is being done. Over the past 25 years, the value of housing under 35s dropped from 31% of the average to 26%. For people aged 35 to 44, it fell from 82% to 69%. For those over 64, it rose from 140% to 144%. The old are getting richer through property, the young are getting locked out, and the gap is widening every single year. Nearly 4 million Australians, 14% of the population, live in poverty. 30% of households experience food insecurity. 20% regularly skip meals or go entire days without eating. In one of the wealthiest countries in human history, sitting on $8.3 trillion of residential land. And here's where it gets truly perverse. The people at the bottom of this system, the renters, the homeless, the working poor, are the ones subsidising the people at the top, through a tax system that rewards property ownership, through rental assistance that gets swallowed by rising rents before it reaches anyone's pocket, through a housing market where every dollar of government stimulus designed to help first home buyers gets absorbed by higher prices, flowing directly to existing owners and investors. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It's just not designed for the people who need housing. It's designed for the people who own it. Here's what most Australians don't understand about homelessness in their own country. Only 5% of homeless people in Australia are sleeping on the streets. The other 95% are invisible. They're in overcrowded houses, 3 families sharing a 2-bedroom apartment because none of them can afford their own lease. They're in boarding houses that charge almost as much as real apartments, but offer no security, no lease, no rights. They're on couches, in cars, in garages, in tents hidden in bushland on the edges of suburbs. 45% of people seeking homelessness support cite domestic and family violence as the primary reason. Women fleeing abusive partners. Women with children. Women who have nowhere safe to go because the rental market has no vacancy and the shelters have no beds. Females accounted for 81.7% of the entire increase in the homeless population between 2016 and 2021. Let me say that again. More than 80% of the growth in homelessness in Australia was women. Older women, aged 55 and above, were the fastest growing group of homeless between 2011 and 2016, increasing by 31%. These are women who spent their lives raising families, often without accumulating superannuation, who find themselves in their 60s with no home and no safety net. And Indigenous Australians are hit hardest of all. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 3% of the population, but 20% of the homeless. Indigenous youth aged 15 to 24 have a homelessness rate of 220 per 10,000. That's 11 times the rate of non-Indigenous youth. Among the richest dirt on the planet, the First Peoples of this country are 11 times more likely to have nowhere to sleep. Of everything in this story, this is the part that should be unforgivable. In 2021, more than 17,600 children under the age of 12 were homeless in Australia. 14,200 families, including 31,500 children of all ages, were without stable housing. These aren't children in developing nations. These aren't children in war zones. These are children in a country that is the fourth wealthiest per adult in the entire world. A country where the average household wealth is $628,000 per person. Homeless children in Australia have a school attendance rate of 85% compared to 94% for non-homeless children. That 9% gap doesn't sound dramatic until you realise what it means. Missed days compound. Missed lessons compound. By the time these children reach high school, they're behind. By the time they're adults, they're likely to be homeless again. 60% of all homeless people in Australia are under 35. 23% are between 12 and 24. The pipeline from childhood homelessness to adult homelessness is almost a straight line. And the government's response? A target of 30,000 new social and affordable homes over 5 years, in a country with 254,000 households waiting for social housing. At that rate, the waiting list will grow faster than the homes being built. Kevin Rudd, back in 2008, launched The Road Home, a white paper with an ambitious target to halve homelessness by 2020. It's now 2026. Homelessness has increased by 28% since that promise was made. Every target missed, every promise broken, every child still sleeping in a car. The political answer to everything is always the same: build more homes. And the numbers look impressive on paper. The government's housing accord targets 1.2 million new homes over 5 years, starting from mid-2024. 240,000 homes per year. It would be the largest construction effort in Australian history. But under current settings, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council estimates only 938,000 dwellings will actually be completed. That's a shortfall of 262,000 homes. Before the ink on the accord is even dry, 250,000 homes are already missing. And here's why. Construction costs have surged. Skilled labour is scarce. Material prices remain elevated. Profit margins on apartment projects have fallen below 5%, leaving developers with no buffer for delays or cost blowouts. Building approvals in Sydney take an average of 173 days. Some are stuck for over 250. Fewer than 1 in 4 Sydney councils meet their own approval timeframes. And the housing that does get built, it's not affordable housing. Entry-level apartments on the Sydney Fringe now cost $1 million. Further out, $1.5 million. These are not starter homes. These are luxury products dressed up as necessity. The Housing Australia Future Fund, the government's flagship policy, has $10 billion in capital. But the Housing Industry Association was blunt. We're still a long way from 40,000 finished homes. Australia doesn't need more press releases, it needs more homes. Meanwhile, the land under those unbuilt homes keeps getting more expensive. Every month, every quarter, every year. The very act of not building makes the problem worse, because the land appreciates while the houses remain imaginary. You cannot build your way out of a crisis when the land itself is the crisis. If housing in Australia is a crisis for millions, it's a goldmine for a very specific few. Property investors are the biggest winners. Negative gearing allows them to deduct losses on investment properties against their personal income. The capital gains tax discount means they only pay tax on half their profits when they sell. Together, these concessions cost the federal budget over $21 billion a year, and the benefits flow overwhelmingly upward. The Parliamentary Budget Office confirmed that 59% of the capital gains tax discount, $12.9 billion, goes to the top 1% of earners, not the top 10%. Not the top 20%, the top 1%. The federal government itself is the second biggest winner. High immigration means more income tax revenue. Rising property values mean more stamp duty and transaction fees. Every politician in Canberra has a direct financial interest in keeping the housing market inflated, because a falling market means falling government revenue. And then there are the voters. 2/3 of Australian households own their home. When property values go up, they feel wealthier. They vote for governments that protect that wealth. Any politician who threatens property values through tax reform, through rent control, through public housing, is threatening the perceived wealth of the majority of voters. This is the trap. The people who suffer from the housing crisis are outnumbered by the people who benefit from it. The homeless don't vote in large numbers. Renters are diffuse and disorganised. Property owners are concentrated, motivated, and electorally powerful. Democracy, in this case, has produced a perfectly democratic disaster. The majority has voted, repeatedly, to enrich itself at the expense of the minority, and the minority sleeps in cars. Australia is one of the richest countries on the planet, fourth highest average wealth per adult in the world, higher than the United States, higher than Germany, higher than Japan. And yet, per capita, Australia's homelessness rate sits alongside countries with a fraction of its wealth. Its public housing stock is among the lowest in the OECD. Its housing affordability is ranked the worst in the developed world outside of Hong Kong. Australia is the only Western democracy without a National Human Rights Act or Charter. There is no constitutional right to housing. There is no legal mechanism that forces the government to house its citizens. Compare that to Austria, where 24% of housing is social housing, or the Netherlands at 30%, or Singapore, where over 80% of the population lives in government-built flats. These are not socialist utopias. They are practical, prosperous nations that decided housing was infrastructure, not a speculative asset. Australia decided the opposite, and the result is $8.3 trillion in land value and 122,000 people with nowhere to sleep. In 2008, Kevin Rudd promised to halve homelessness by 2020. In 2026, homelessness is higher than it has ever been. The targets were missed, the promises were abandoned, and the land just kept getting more expensive. The solutions are not mysterious. They've been proposed by economists, housing researchers, and the people on the front lines for decades. Build public housing at scale. Australia did it for 30 years after the war, and it worked. Home ownership went from 53% to 71%. The infrastructure exists. The knowledge exists. The political will doesn't. Reform the tax system. Reduce the capital gains discount. Phase out negative gearing. The OECD, the Grattan Institute, the Australia Institute, and the Australian Council of Social Service have all recommended exactly this. An OECD report in 2026 specifically called for replacing stamp duties with a land tax. Increase rent assistance by at least 60%, the figure recommended by Mission Australia, so it actually keeps pace with actual rents instead of lagging years behind. Match immigration to housing capacity. You cannot bring in 300,000 new residents every year into a country that builds fewer homes than it loses to decay. And fundamentally, treat housing as a right, not an asset class. Every other form of essential infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, is built and maintained by government because the market alone cannot serve everyone. Housing is no different. But here's the truth that sits underneath all of this. Every single one of these solutions costs money. Money that currently flows to property investors through tax breaks. Money that currently inflates government revenue through stamp duty. Money that currently enriches the 66% of households who already own their homes. Fixing the housing crisis means taking money from people who vote and giving it to people who don't. And in a democracy, that is the hardest thing in the world to do. $8.3 trillion. That's what the land is worth. Not the houses, not the buildings, just the dirt. In dollar terms, residential land values in Australia have increased by nearly $8.4 trillion over the past 25 years. That single number, the growth in land value alone, is larger than the GDP of every country on Earth, except the United States and China. And somewhere in Sydney tonight, a woman and her two children are sleeping in a car. She works, she pays taxes, she contributes to the economy that inflates the very land prices that locked her out. Somewhere in Melbourne, an older woman, 63 years old, retired, no superannuation, is calling a homelessness hotline for the fourth time this month. She'll be told there's no space, again. Somewhere in Brisbane, a 26-year-old tradie who earns above the median wage is sharing a 3-bedroom house with 5 other people because even a decent salary can't compete with a market this broken. This isn't a story about bad luck. This is a story about choices, policy choices, tax choices, investment choices. Choices made by governments that knew exactly what would happen and chose to let it happen anyway, because the people who benefit outnumber the people who suffer. $8.3 trillion in land, 122,000 people with nowhere to sleep, 3.2 million one crisis away from joining them. If that doesn't make you angry, it should. If this video hit you the way I think it did, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'm pulling back the curtain on the countries that look wealthy from the outside and are collapsing from within. Next week, I'm covering the country that imported millions of workers and forgot to build them homes, and the political earthquake it caused. Drop a comment. Tell me what shocked you most. I'll see you in the next one.